ora everybody, I'm Anna Butler. I'm the General Manager of the Building Systems Performance Branch at MB, and I'm really happy to be here and talk to you guys this afternoon about what might be getting in the way of change and innovation in the building sector. So, where do I point? So, at MB, we are all really passionate about the building sector. We all live, work and play in buildings, and our homes define and depict the value that we have in our society and the people that live in homes. As a central regulator, we have a leadership role in shaping and driving change in the building system. And when we think about the system, we have 4 areas where regulation can influence change. We set minimum performance standards. We want those performance requirements to be clear, reasonable, and look to the future. People are a really important part in our system. We want a skilled, accountable, and available workforce, and we need consumers who are able to make informed decisions. Regulatory and commercial processes, particularly around building consents, need to be risk-based and efficient, and building products need to be reliable and fit for purpose. The challenge for us is ensuring that regulatory interventions and incentives are balanced across those levers, that they're evidence-based, and they're proportionate to the harms against which we're protecting. Because the core purpose of regulation is to protect the public from harm. It's the common defining feature of all regulatory systems. And the current strong focus in our building regulatory regime is on protecting life safety. Now, we've got a range of levers. We can provide advice to the government on legislative and regulative settings. We can provide information and guidance. We can seek assurance from other players in the system around their performance. We can monitor trends, we can look across the system and make sure that it is high performing. What we need to do is make sure that the regulations do their job, but don't get in the way of the industry changing for the better through things like innovative ideas and approaches. It's a balancing act between providing the flexibility people need to innovate and change and the certainty that the public will be protected from harm. And that is not a simple task. When we think about the regulatory system, it's critical that we take a long-term view. It means not simply responding to immediate needs, but thinking what good might look like in the future, 10, 20, 30 years from now. We know that there are areas where the system is getting in the way of people using new methods, products, and technologies. The performance-based system, in theory, allows these things, but we know we can make it better and easier to navigate. Looking at the areas we can shape with regulation and the levers we have, we are focusing on 4 key initiatives this morning, and you heard a bit about them from the Minister this morning. The first is a skills strategy and action plan for the construction sector, a plan to build the capacity and capability of the sector, asking the critical question of what is the skill profile we're going to need in the future. The More Efficient Consenting project will test how we can give greater clarity, consistency and certainty through the building consent process, with an initial focus on medium and high density and off-site and offshore manufacturing. Incentives and innovations to address how risks are managed and liability is allocated across the chain is key to unlocking some of the risk aversion we currently experience in the system. And a review of building products aims to ensure that the product assurance and regulatory systems are fit for purpose. So I've talked a bit about regulation being about protecting from harm and not getting in the way, trying to be an enabler of innovation, but regulation can also play a role in driving a step change in the industry. That should only happen where it is clear that government intervention is what is needed to drive change and that it is the best approach. It's a big lever to pull, and it's a hard one to get right, and it's one in which competing objectives need to be balanced. We've talked a lot today about balancing the minimum with affordability, for example. As a regulator, we do accept that we have a role to play, absolutely. We fully support and endorse the work of the Industry Transformation Agenda and its approach of calling for action at the government, sector and firm levels. It's our view that regulation alone is not going to get us there. The industry also has to take a leading role, and we are very keen to partner with you on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. A really, really informative discussion, but I think equally, certainly for the design and construction community that's sitting here amongst us today, inspiring in the sense that, you know, there's the sense of open collaboration and I guess real sincerity, and to the point that, you know, you do recognise that we're not exactly where we need to be in terms of that level of collaboration, but certainly a great place to start. So thank you. So Jeff Farrenson from Auckland City Council. Jeff is the planning manager.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm the inspections manager, so for the building control team. That's all right. I have a team of about 150 inspectors doing nearly 1,000 inspections every day across Auckland, so it's pretty hectic out there. But what I'm going to do today, have we got that remote? Is I'm just going to go through it from a building inspector's perspective. We see a lot of innovation out there in the industry. It's sometimes not as quick as we'd like it to be. There's products and materials and systems always coming on board, designed, built in New Zealand or overseas. And it's always a challenge trying to align those to satisfy ourselves on reasonable grounds that it's compliant with the building code. And that's probably one of the reasons why we are quite risk adverse, and I will admit that. We do have cookbook acceptable solutions, which are very easy to approve products, but the minute you get something outside of the box, it does take a little bit of time to try and approve it in terms of compliance. So this discussion today is more challenge, and it's about the risks that we see out there that are holding us back and how we can look to address some of these. So the first one, these are just topical risks. So we've got a really long list, but these are just basically some of the stuff we see nowadays. Gaps in building codes. It's probably more accurate to say the building code is out of date, or there are some, we haven't kept up with the latest technology. So there's building there, great building, but it's between 10 and 25 metres high, and the E2 claddings don't match it. So every building that comes into council has to be looked at with a microscope, so to speak, because of the leaky homes that we've had in the past. And you have a lot of specific design going into these buildings now. You know, you've got facade engineering involvements and calculations and all sorts of wind loadings there. ACP panels, cladding, that's an issue that's quite well known at the moment, and we're seeing now when we get new cladding systems being proposed, we have to look a lot closer in terms of the fire ratings. Passive fire is another issue. It's quite topical. We haven't come across one passive fire QA system in the industry yet which is even close to being self-certifying. So in a building like this, you would have tens of thousands of penetrations, and unfortunately the inspectors have to look at every single one of those now at this stage. Structural steel, we've got a 52-storey building going up in Auckland made out of structural steel that's been imported from another country. Again, the risks of getting that wrong are huge. So determining the molecular strength of that structural steel in terms of the mill. So we've got, I'll give you an example. We've got a building where we're using structural steel round columns in Auckland. The steel was milled in Korea, and we had to do some research. We sent a team over there to the mill. It went from there to Thailand to be fabricated and welded into round columns. Again, we had to make sure that it was the same steel that came from Korea for a start that made it there, and then the welding itself that took place was appropriate. And then when it arrived in New Zealand, it had the intrumescent paint coatings and everything else put on it, and we had to make sure that that full traceability went all the way back to where that steel came from. It was a big project, and now that's happening all over the place. Our duty of care, we can't really say too much more about this. Inspectors in our team really take it to heart when they hear of failures, and I know that there's been criticism in the past about missing things, but I think at the end of the day, a snapshot, an inspection is a snapshot at any point in time during construction, and when things are missed, I think we need to look at why it was missed and how we can avoid that rather than blaming it. And if we look at things like quality assurance as being one of our targets for focusing on, I think we'll get better quality overall. And fraud, I won't go too much into that, but we're getting a lot of certificates sent to us, that claim things that we find out later on aren't correct, or even just blatantly fraudulent. So again, even the documentation that we're seeing out there, we still have to scrutinise, and that just takes more time as well. So the cost of these risks at the moment, we use our inspection regime. We do 15 inspections per house, and we're failing 27% in Auckland at the moment, so that's 19 inspections for a house. Now, if you had a good QA system, we could reduce those inspections to 4, and we've done this with some good companies, where they install a quality assurance program, drops their fail rates down to nearly 0%. We reduce the inspections. It's that simple. We keep audits in place so that we randomly check every now and then, but we can get it down to 4 inspections from 19. Now, if you've got a house, a standard house, that equates to about $2,500 savings in inspection fees. But if you've got a lot of houses, it adds up over the year. These are the sorts of issues we're seeing now. I mean, these are things that are being built, and the people who are building them are relying on inspectors to pick them up, or not relying on inspectors to pick them up. You've got to ask the question why it even gets that far. So the 40,000 inspections that we failed last year, 6.8 million in fees, and that doesn't even equate. That doesn't even take into account the amount of rework, the extra remedial work you need to take, the time frame delays, and rebooking another inspection, and so on, pulling contractors off other sites. So the costs are huge, and it's really simple. Developing a QA program, it's been proven. We've got good companies out there that do it now. You will reduce your fail rate, I guarantee it. And if you do reduce your fail rate, we're willing to reduce the regulatory oversight. And we've got programs in place, a QP, Qualified Partner Program at the council. We can do that for you. It's obviously going to save time, less rework, double handling, and a better build quality. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you. Very insightful. Again, it's just, I think what I'm hearing is the willingness to collaborate and certainly work together towards improving not only processes but equally efficiencies as well. So outstanding, thank you. Next up is Damon Otto. So Damon is from the Designer Digital Construction Company, Torwood, based here in New Zealand.
Thank you. That's great. So 25% fail rate in buildings. So apply that to cars and sort of see how safe you feel. So I'm going to talk about the case for change and innovation in the building industry. I'm going to go through pretty quickly. And my view when I was given this topic to talk about was actually, is it a fear of change and a lack of innovation, or basically are our settings wrong? So our settings currently is A for average. So the building code is set up for a minimum viable product. And it's kind of foolhardy and a bit silly to think that we get innovation, we get high quality buildings when everything is set to averages. So where's the incentive to basically go above average? And one of the poor things about getting A for average, or having this average idea, is that we have all these flow-on effects which have massive consequences to our building industry. So if we are aiming for average, we don't really need too much knowledge, because we aren't looking to be ambitious and exceed what we need to do. If we aim for average, we always talk about average costs. We have a system which is perfectly set up to deliver the average house. So we have the split of fractals and monoliths. We have the 1% and the 90%, or the 99%, with not a lot of incentive to change, or space to change, or space to engage the R&D and the kind of R&D I've been able to engage in at Toolwood. And so there's a safety in numbers approach. Gaining acceptance above code is not incentivized and fraught with uncertainty. And anybody in this room, I can imagine the compliance hurdles with getting a grey water discharge would be an absolute nightmare. And so we end up in this industry where we have this paradox of differing values. So on the left, on the left, we've got an average New Zealand space company. And on the right, we've got an average New Zealand building company. I'm going to make a linkage to the space industry later on, which will be less radical, I promise. But this comes back from our differing values. So in our industry, there's very little incentive to change. There's very little ambition to change. There's no responsibility, or at least not the mechanism to take responsibility when one wants to change. And that comes down to things like some questions up on the board, like, well, where's the insurance industry? Where is the finance industry? Where are these players there that we could actually engage to take some responsibility and do things ourselves at a high quality level? There is a background of cynicism and failure, which is evident in the leaky building crisis. And there's uncertainty in the supply chain and in compliance. My view on the building code is actually, as a performance-based code, it's actually pretty good, but it's really geared up to conflate standards with being mandatory. So you step into the grey zone of the, as Jeff mentioned, the 10 to 25 zone, and you know you're in a world of trouble. So we need to increase certainty in our supply chain and in our compliance. Supply chain is absolutely the biggest thing that we focus on. Off-site manufacture is all about supply chain. Now that I've given you all the bad news, I'm going to kind of bring it back a bit, so bear with me. So my view is that actually change is inevitable, it's coming, and we've got no choice about that. So the visible black swan is what I call it, because the black swan of 2008, the GFC crisis, happened, but some people saw it. So the idea is that actually is a case for change coming, and it starts with this man here. So we have 100,000 houses that we need to build. Interestingly, that's not going to do much for us. It's not about scale here. Scale is part of it, of course, but there's other things. If you watch the States and part of Europe, venture capital flowing into the built environment industry. A key example of this is Katerra. Katerra is a Silicon-based company with $1 billion in funding. They just bought Michael Green Architecture, and they are absolutely going ahead. Although I have heard that actually Toolwood has actually built more than Katerra, but we don't have the $1 billion worth of funding yet. The city outsourced. So Toronto basically giving a whole stretch of waterfront to Google to go and to develop through Cyborg Labs. So if we can't do it, someone else will come in and actually do that, because there's value in cities, and I think we've talked about that a lot today. Build to rent. Build to rent is the biggest residential class that's coming. You can see it coming from a mile away. It's going to hit New Zealand as well. This is where we actually provide amenity to rental tenants and provide quality and professionalise landlordship. Digital transformation, and this is my bag. There's a nice little drone there flying bricks around. That's a distraction. We don't have to worry about drones or 3D printing. Digital transformation means we can actually know and simulate everything we build and design. Every tool I need to do the work I need to do is there. It just needs to be joined up. And highly speculative, but something I like to talk about is signal and spatial economies, where we actually generate income through information. If anyone wants to talk to me about that, I can talk about that later, because that's a whole subject in itself. So coming back to space, in 2005, 2004, the X Prize was announced to basically give $10 million to the first team that could fly a spacecraft up into orbit with 3 people on board and back down again. What has that got to do with the built environment? Today we have a $2 billion private space industry. Rocket Lab is actually arguably there in New Zealand because of this X Prize back in 2004. my view is that actually you need a compelling, massive incentive to get what we want. I do agree that getting clients to tell us what they want is great, but actually no one knew about that they wanted a Tesla electric car until someone made it. And to finish off, a manifesto for change. So if we wanted to get an X Prize type and massive incentive, this is my view of what we need to put in place. The first one, most important one, is essentially a housing stock that is optimized for health and to minimize harm. Design that is completely and utterly in the digital realm. Construction that is absolutely ruthless with regards to waste and cost. And then a built environment that actually contributes to health and well-being, and actually we can start to get into things like the signal and spatial economy and generate things like UBI. So that's our mantra, and I guess the key thing for us is that we want to absolutely normalise excellent, radically excellent built environment in New Zealand. And we actually got the chance to do that right now. So we should be ambitious. Thank you.
Damon, thank you. Inspiring, certainly thought-provoking on a whole lot of different levels, and I'd be certainly happy to engage the audience in some feedback and comments certainly around Project X or any other sort of initiatives that might be percolating away. So next up, Felician from Managing Director of Greenstone Group.
Thanks, Michelle. We've got, if I press this right, we've got a very fragmented market. The property market generates 1/8 of New Zealand's GDP, so it's by no means small. 8% of people are employed in the industry and 24% are female. 50% of the businesses have less than 20 employees compared to manufacturing where it's 20%. 23% have more than 100 employees, manufacturing it's 50%. So you can see that we've got a real challenge from the start when we've got lots of small things happening across the cottage industry that is our construction sector. But isn't innovation sort of the big bang thing? Not really. What we need is smart solutions that are regenerating. We need innovations not only the result of a hallelujah or a big bang moment, it's a result of a culture that creates incremental and continuous gains. It's creating a sustainable, economic and well-defined and measurable process. The iPhone wasn't created in a moment of hallelujah. It was a relentless passion that drove many changes in hardware, software, materiality, access, accessories, content. And it's the culture that created that moment. The culture of that business, it was the culture of that system that created that moment. It wasn't one man. And that's what we need to keep in mind with our industry. We also need to own it, not government. Governments come and go. So what we're talking about is an ecosystem, basically an end-to-end ecosystem that creates the ideas, designs things, builds things, owns things, manages things. I've worked for a few big corporates like Westfield and Multiplex, and the power that they have with the information they have at their fingertips is immense. It's exciting. You know, you can walk down the corridor and you can find out exactly what something costs. You can talk to the builder about the program. What's the impact if we change this late in the piece? What about that? You talk to the leasing guys. You get that feedback loop. Having that feedback loop is imperative. We've also got to align motivations, rewards and incentives. It doesn't have to be a single business. Obviously, partnerships are a big part of this. Joint ventures are commonly used, alliances. All good counters to our fragmented industry. Kudos to Tallwood for a moment. You know, they've created a system, they've pulled in architects, they've created what I would call a closed design system where they've connected everyone and they all understand what the outcomes are. And it's that kind of process, it's that kind of development that we really need to focus on if we are to make changes. Greater collaboration enables specialisation, and we need specialisation. Specialisation enables investment in training, technology, research and development. You can't do it if you're a generalist or if you've only got 5 staff. You just can't do specialisation. Such systems allow the participants, especially developers and builders, to develop plans for medium to long-term horizons as well. The support of the developer and the builder then get from the creative, the supplier, the subcontractors and delivery partners, and they can build off that and build their medium-term aspirations. I think these systems were there some years ago. They were probably a little bit undeveloped, but they've been decimated by the cycle of property. One of my key things here is we've got to move from intellectual understanding to behavioural competency. And a shout out to Sam who was talking earlier. We have a number 8 why mentality. We all want to do it for ourselves to prove that we can do it. And once we've done it once, we're proclaimed experts. I've been guilty of this in the past, being a consultant. But to be an expert, you have to have done it more than once. Studying, talking about a project, doing it once exhibits intellectual understanding. But we need the industry to move more to behavioural competency with ingrained systems and knowledge. Such ecosystems are needed to create behavioural competence. Many organisations go through a learning curve. HNZ's going through one now. They've got a massive workload in front of them and they're trying to change the way they work. But as they will tell you, it takes time. I think this is where KiwiBuild can assist. It's the carrot of forward workload of a similar repeatable nature, but the industry needs to come together more to create these opportunities and the market challenges that require thought and testing. The solution won't be a product. The solution will be a system or a range of systems that delivers and evolves over time. But we also need leaders with vision who do not buy into yesterday's stories and the constraints of today. Using the iPhone example again, it is well known that Steve Jobs had a reality distortion field. He used that to challenge the industry and people's thinking, and he succeeded. KiwiBuild is Twyford's reality distortion field. He's challenging us, and time will tell if we can all come together and rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Phil, thank you. Again, another really inspiring, thought-provoking session. And certainly I really do like the idea of a regenerating solution as opposed to perhaps the much-coined innovation, which is not always necessarily understood. So, yeah, thank you for that. So next up we have Kevin Sheets from MSP Consultants. Strangely enough, a lot of the questions, of course, that are coming through are centric or related to the building code and certainly the requirement. So I think Kevin's next session will be really quite interesting for many. Thank you.
Kia ora. Just in the way of background, my wife and I live in a former state house, which is built in the 1940s and still has its original concrete roof in place. It's wearing very, very well, and I think it's an element that we can't neglect in the way we talk about sustainability in our built environment. I have to say that we did upgrade it interior-wise. The outside still looks like an old state house, and we're very proud of that. And it has been assessed at a 6 home star and is very, very comfortable to live in. Now, in terms of change, I just thought it useful to think about change in the context of what that means, because certainly we all know that change for the sake of change doesn't equal progress. But there can be no progress without change. But obviously, value creation has to be our common and industry objective. As Jeff touched on before, our industry in recent times has become extremely risk averse, not just building officials, I've got to say, Jeff, but right through the entire industry. And it's very, very clear and evident that it resists change unless there is very, very clear evidence that it adds value and it doesn't put the specifier or the user or the building officials at risk. And we can't just live with the old adage that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because clearly we're here today because part of it at least is broken and we do need to fix it. With increased productivity and better homes in mind, our industry needs to become increasingly familiar with what is known as risk-based decision making. You may well argue that we're doing that right now, particularly as it relates to health and safety, because the builders and tradies on the job are undertaking that as a matter of course. Others, including architects and designers, do that in the way that they are actually fabricating designs, putting together the various components for the builders to build to. They go through a process of having a look at the level of risk associated with their designs. Risk-based decision making asks a number of key questions, and forgive me for if you're familiar with this whole approach, but basically it asks a number of questions. What can go wrong? How likely are the problems to occur? How severe might the potential problems be? Is the risk of potential problems tolerable? And what can be done to lessen or eliminate the risk? When you look at new products and systems, and I think of systems really being the composite, the element that requires a whole range of different products. I provocatively say that products don't deliver performance, it's the building system that does. And I don't envy the task of specifiers in this day and age that have to look at innovation in terms of choice of building materials going into the systems they specify. One of the issues that we do confront, and it's been touched on, is our existing and traditional channel to market, particularly for building materials, because the general merchant is seen by builders, and I'm generalising here deliberately, as a simple and efficient one-stop shop. It reduces their complexity administratively when they're dealing with a merchant. There's a few materials that go directly to the builder from the manufacturer or supplier, but the vast majority and the bulk of the value and the cost in materials goes through general merchants. It is being questioned. There are alternatives being looked at, and I certainly will look forward to the whole industry looking at alternatives to the traditional channels. But we have an extremely geographically dislocated, geographically isolated industry, and it becomes very difficult to see how, in the current environment, we won't be able to get rid of the existing channel to market in a hurry. But nonetheless, products versus systems I touched on before. I mean, in terms of the building code, I certainly have a view that it's long overdue for a total relook. I'm hoping, and I'm looking at Anna here, that the industry is able to engage in a meaningful partnership, and I emphasise the word partnership, with the public sector in this regard, because I truly believe that we have a lot to offer in regard to improving what has been in place for 30-odd years now, well, nearly 40 years really, without a significant amount of change. I'm involved with standards development both here and in Australia, and certainly we lack some aspects of to really ensure that we have better building systems in place to meet the demands of our home and building owners and occupants going into 20 years' time in 2038. We've touched on a vision of what that should be, and I believe that as an industry, collaborating with this government, we need to get a very clear picture jointly of what that needs to be. We cannot, meander around without having a very clear vision of what that is. Warranties. Where are we? Warranties, the old adage is it's only good as the paper they read on. That's not true. It really is the integrity of the entity that's making those warranties. And there's lots of pretty nefarious warranties out there now. Certainly within the Building Act, we've got the implied warranties. But I believe personally that we need to have the funders, the banks, demanding, as they do in the UK, a third-party warranty insurance for home builders and covering those who are going to be living in those houses. I think what I'll do is I'll just quickly flip on to this. This is just more of a provocation, to be perfectly honest. A few thoughts. As I said, we've touched on the fact that risk-based assessment is here. It's here to stay. Let's get it more expanded on. Let's apply some greater understanding and education around it. Third-party warranties, I've touched on that. But I'd certainly be very, very keen to ensure that some of our building levy, which MB gather very joyfully, I'm sure, is heavily invested in working with industry to create better verification methods and also invest also into more performance-based standards that can help us all in the industry. Industry also has a responsibility, particularly SMEs, builders, tradies, to invest in their staff. In Auckland particularly, and speaking as the chair of Certified Builders and also deputy chair of the BCITO, Auckland is absolutely woeful in terms of our industry investing in staff development. I really would like to see a greater case for encouraging that, and it's good to hear the Minister talking about investing in government projects or public projects supporting training and education. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Excellent. So, yeah, wow. Fascinating session, and that I think if I take from, Phil's comments earlier around the opportunity to create an ecosystem, and I think as I look around the room, there's already so much change that's starting to happen and eventuate, and a real desire and an obvious, recognition that the sector has to change from design right through to construction, delivery and beyond, and all the fundamentals that sit in the middle of that. But equally, that's not always easy to do in terms of, who's going to lead. And I look at some of the questions that are coming through, and these are some of the items that are being highlighted. Who's going to lead? Who's going to share the risk? If I am having to transform, innovate, make some significant changes in my business, and take on new forms of capability, new processes, new systems, who's going to help share that risk? And these are real issues, I think, for every individual and certainly for every business that's sitting here today. So I'd like to open it up to, got a bit more time, I've got about 7 minutes left, so time to respond to some of your questions, and thank you so much, such a great response. So if I start with probably the most popular question, which is about the code. So when will code be updated to align with international codes, as it is failing Kiwis at a level of protection? So if I could maybe just start, of course, with Anna, and certainly Jeff, if you were able to respond. And I think it would be great to get Damon to actually respond to this as well from a design delivery response. That'd be great. Thank you.
So look, we work on the code full time, and it's something that we are always looking to improve and update. I think it's fair to say that in recent times the focus has been much more on seismicity and applying the learnings that we all got out of Christchurch, and we've been pretty focused on fire for a couple of years now. So that means that the energy efficiency requirements and things in the code haven't had the attention that some of those other areas have had. We are turning our mind to that now and starting to think about what that might look like. We have a government that is very committed to climate change as well, and zero emissions. So we're starting to think through what is good going to look like in this space, and I welcome your comments around we need a shared vision about what that is and what we're all aiming for. So we've started thinking about that. We've certainly, I noticed the question talked about international standards. We are definitely looking at that, looking at the research and understanding what is it that we all want to aim for. What do we want the standard in our code to be?
Thank you. Jeff, your response.
I don't really. I'm not familiar with international codes, so I can't compare the two. But what I do know is we're working closely with MB and giving them as much feedback as we can and what we see out there. And you've got code clauses like G6, which is the noise, which is one of our big complaint numbers coming in now. So we sound test new buildings when people move into them. And what we're finding is those reports come back from the acoustic engineers and they're only just making that bare minimum code requirement. So what people don't realise moving into these buildings is it still allows noise to come through that wall. You might not hear the words, but you'll hear the mumbling. And that's the sort of stuff that I think the more we see in Auckland, the more we need to lift that STC rating up, or the impact noise. E3 internal moisture is another issue. I have inspectors that will do a final inspection on a house that's been lived in and it'll have condensation on the windows, a brand new house. So clearly, yeah, we give this feedback and we're in workshops, we're in a working group at the moment looking at 5 or 6 different code clauses to try and improve those. Looking at the industry though, we'd like to see more of the tendering or the procurement process include in the tendering the life of the building. So not just build the building, build and maintain. So if you buy an on-site wastewater plant, you're generally buying an on-site wastewater plant with a maintenance contract that goes with it. If I'm building a building and I'm knowing that I'm going to be maintaining that, I'll be putting in higher quality materials and products, knowing that I do less maintenance in the long run.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I'm interested in international codes, but particularly when it comes to supply chain and materials mostly. And there's lots of cases where overseas materials meet European codes, for example, and then we do a side-by-side analysis of how that's been produced and what we need to comply with. We find they're equivalent, but because they're not in the code, we into this whole sort of grey area of compliance, which is really problematic. But be careful what you wish for. I mean, the air quality is a massive, as well as noise. Air quality is a massive mega trend for health. And if you go into somewhere like Munich, then they will do air quality testing of your environment, internal environment. It doesn't meet the code, you're in massive trouble. It really comes down to what society values. And in terms of valuing air quality in this country, it's not even on the radar.
Great, thank you. I've just got another question here, and it's a very popular question, and it's around essentially the building code again. But somebody's actually in the audience asked the question as to why don't we all agree collectively in the room at the moment to deliver projects to a higher standard, higher than the building code. So again, if I can point that question back to Anna, Jeff, Damon, given that you're dealing with these issues on a daily basis, so just if you could quickly comment on that perspective. How easy is it for us to actually collectively agree and assign a new level of standard and performance?
Well, look, from my perspective, the building code is a minimum requirement. It's not a target. So I certainly encourage people to aim higher than that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Ditto. Under the Building Act, we can't enforce any more than that minimum code requirement. We can definitely recommend. A good example is we are really bringing to light universal design in pre-application meetings and stuff like that. So, if we can get that information out there, we will.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's actually the close of our session. I apologise that we haven't got through to all of your questions, but obviously the team will be available later, and so please feel free to reach out and ask questions from them. They're more than happy to share information. But I think certainly from what I hear from this panel and the panel who've spoken earlier, we are at a point of change. It's not so much about disruption because I believe innovation's already percolating, and certainly, the earlier panellists spoke to that. But I also think that, we've got some massive obstacles to overcome. We've still got building materials at something like 70% more than what our friends across the Tasman are paying. So some real obvious challenges that have got to be broken down, and it's one thing to innovate, but to innovate, in this type of environment where you have got those real very real challenges for businesses to overcome can be very difficult. I really thank the panellists today, sharing their insights. Phil, I think your comments around the ecosystem and collaboration is just fantastic. So thank you very much. Thank you.